Thank you, Mr. Makula. I give the floor to Ms. Jennifer Robinson. Ms. Robinson, you have 7 minutes.
First, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to address the forum this afternoon. As Director of Legal Advocacy for the Bertha Foundation Justice Initiative, I have a unique global and comparative perspective of the treatment of minorities through the work of our partner organisations who are at the cutting edge of human rights litigation and advocacy on behalf of minority communities around the world. Before this, and for more than a decade, I have worked on issues associated with the marginalisation and persecution of Indigenous West Papuans, a minority in Indonesia. In this context, I have seen the treatment of West Papuans is emblematic of the discrimination suffered by minorities worldwide, and among the most severe I have seen. The recommendations must ultimately be judged by their ability to address the most isolated and difficult of situations. To that end, I address the draft recommendations on minorities and the exercise of police powers in relation to West Papua. At the heart of violations suffered by minorities in West Papua and elsewhere, it is racism, dehumanisation and discrimination. In West Papua, this aspect of Indonesian oppression has been emphasised by Philip Karma, the Nobel Peace Prize nominee, who was finally released last week after spending more than a decade in prison for simply raising the West Papuan Morning Star flag. Karma's book, which I have with me, Seakan Kita Orang Setengah Binatang, or As If We Were Half Animals, explains that racism is key to understanding both West Papua's annexation by Indonesia and the ongoing abuse today. The fact that the 1969 UN-supervised vote on self-determination was allowed to proceed with only 1,025 representatives of a population of 800,000 was a decision grounded in racial discrimination. West Papuans, diplomats considered that West Papuans were too primitive to have the popular vote that they were entitled to under international law. The UN turned a blind eye to these unlawful voting methods and the violence in the self-determination process. It was not a free or fair vote. This grave injustice meant that Papuans became a minority within Indonesia, instead of establishing their own independent state. While Papuans made up 96% of the population in the region at that time, they have, as a result of sustained violence and deliberate assimilation policies, they are now a minority in their own land, representing only 42% of the population, which is projected to drop to just 30% by 2020. Against this backdrop, I welcome Recommendation 22, recognising that minorities are disproportionately the subject of human rights violations. Hundreds of thousands of Papuans are estimated to have suffered extrajudicial killings, torture, sexual violence and enforced disappearances at the hands of Indonesian police and military forces. Peaceful protests are regularly met with excessive force and mass arrests. The International Coalition on Papua reports that, on average, there is more than one known extrajudicial killing each month in security operations. All victims are Indigenous Papuans, who are not necessarily linked to political activism, but they are generally targeted because of their racial identity. I say known cases because many extrajudicial executions and cases of excessive force go unreported because human rights defenders, journalists and international observers have limited or no access to West Papua. I welcome Recommendation 23 calling for states to document and prosecute these cases and the Recommendations 17 to 19 on data collection to demonstrate these patterns of racial discrimination and abuse. However, in this regard, I emphasise the role for local and international civil society in improving documentation and in promoting the protection of minorities that is envisaged in Recommendation 57. Previous Indonesian administrations denied that there were any political prisoners in West Papua, but a civil society documentation project called Papuans Behind Bars was created with international support to provide the statistical data to prove that this was false. We now know that there are as many as 100 political prisoners, all Indigenous West Papuans, in prisons today. It is essential that a recommendation be included to ensure states allow international organisations access to regions like West Papua to assist and support local civil society, which will ensure the role envisaged for them in Recommendation 57. In light of the abuse of police powers we see in West Papua and elsewhere, I welcome Recommendation 20 calling for the prohibition of discriminatory exercise of police powers of arrest. In West Papua, we've seen mass arrests at peaceful protests and torture and mistreatment in pre-charge detention. Several hundred arrests are documented each year, again, where Indigenous Papuans are unfairly targeted for exercising their democratic rights. In this regard, the recommendation should include specific concern about the criminalisation of social protest by minorities, an increasing global trend we see through the work of our Birther Justice Initiative partners. I also welcome Recommendation 21 on the need for practical guidance on the impartial application of the law. In Indonesia, treason laws are unfairly and disproportionately applied against Indigenous Papuans who peacefully exercise their right to freedom of expression. Further, West Papuans are criminalised for displaying the Morning Star flag. Despite the flag being recognised as a cultural symbol under special autonomy laws, subsequent laws have banned its use. These laws are used to criminalise Indigenous Papuans to prevent their cultural heritage and their legitimate expression of nationalism and political will. This recommendation should therefore go further than addressing the discriminatory application of law to require states to repeal laws that are discriminatory on their face and which permit police to discriminate against minorities in this way. Finally, I welcome Recommendation 26, requiring police to report and prosecute crimes against minorities. However, the problem is that police are very often the perpetrators. I emphasise the importance of recommendations requiring states to ensure justice for state crimes against minorities. In West Papua, security forces enjoy almost absolute impunity, which reinforces these discriminatory and violent practices and reinforces to Papuans that the criminal justice system only works against them and not for them. There should be clear recommendations to international and regional organisations to supervise compliance with these recommendations. As the Melanesian Spearhead Group and Pacific Islands Forum propose solidarity and fact-finding missions to West Papua in response to these concerns I have mentioned here, it is also important to include recommendations to ensure states like Indonesia allow such missions unimpeded access. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. I give